So one of the questions that people who come to the Hermitage ask most frequently is where to begin with reading the discourses. Is there a particular order, and are certain discourses more suitable to begin with than others? Now, if someone asks you a question like that, then how would you reply?
To give a very technical answer, one thing worth mentioning is that the Digha Nikaya has by proportion, it has the most suttas addressed to householders. So that is one consideration, though maybe not the most important.
So what would be, to your mind, the most important consideration?
Well, it depends what people are coming to the practice for. Oftentimes, the starting point that at least I had, the reasons I became interested in the Dhamma, I've learned need to change over time. So, for me, just reading as many as possible and kind of getting a taste for what they was important. Others may not have so much of but others might not need that. So, depending on people's proclivities, that would be worth taking into account. But of course, something worth mentioning is that in the suttas there's this distinction between people who have right view and those who don't. And perhaps explaining some of the indications in the suttas that might let you know, oh, is this addressed to somebody with or without right view?
Right. So, to be clear about this, the discourses are records of conversations, right? People approaching the Buddha and other awakened beings and asking them their questions and their difficulties. So is there a single discourse where two people who do not have the right view are having a conversation?
No.
So the chief value of the discourses then, to start with, is that there's always at least a noble disciple or else an arahat appearing on the scene in order to clarify certain matters. And this is why the collection of Nikayas stand out from other writings. Let's put it like that. Otherwise it would just be a collection of ordinary conversations, and that doesn't really go anywhere. Now then there is the possibility that noble ones are giving instructions to those who do not yet have a right view, and there is the possibility that noble ones are having a conversation among themselves, basically. And now you are saying that it is good to keep in mind that there is a distinction between those who have a right view and those who do not. Now, how is a newcomer who is about to dive into the discourses going to find out whether there is a conversation between two noble ones or not? And why should that matter? What is the attitude of someone who is approaching the discourses now that we have introduced this distinction?
I think it's also a matter of becoming clear what is right view and not, and it's a very wide, very open discussion, since it can be discussed over this matter for a long time without having a common point of view, depending on how one can read the text, because also this maybe has to be mentioned. The text can be the Pali Canon can be read in or interpreted in different ways, and then each way pretending to have the right view.
Yes, so in the end, someone needs to check it within their own experience.
Yes.
Which means what? Let's go one step back. What is the attitude of someone who approaches the discourses?
If they are coming to it for the first time.
Yeah.
Or that they, for example, you're talking about two noble ones having a conversation. They shouldn't assume that they are in a position to understand what is being spoken about. So they shouldn't assume that this applies to me. For example, anapanasati or these kind of, or satipattanas. That is a fatal error to assume that what I am reading, my interpretation of what is being written, is correct, and that I'm in a position to practice now, because that is undermining your ability to question the assumptions that you're bringing to this interpretation.
Exactly. So if someone assumes that all the discourses are on the same level, so to speak, that they equally apply to everyone, and that those instructions and those teachings and those contemplations, that they can at once put that into practice, and obscuring the fact that the right view is something to be acquired, not by making some big donation or by performing an esoteric ceremony of some sort, but by understanding these Four Noble Truths directly for oneself. If that is overlooked, then that's actually an obstacle for coming to see the Dhamma. If somebody thinks they have already understood but has in fact not been understood, then it will prevent them from understanding what needs to be understood. So the attitude has to be what? The attitude is, I am reading a text and I don't yet know what this is about. And so reading a text then it's not about accumulating information, but about questioning one's own views and assumptions and checking whether that is in accordance with the noble views that are expressed in the discourses. Right? Are we going to say all this to people who come here and ask where to begin with reading the discourses?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That is what we should be saying. Now, if we have introduced this distinction between those who are of right view and those who are not, and we see that it is important to start out by saying one doesn't have right view, and so this is something to acquire. Suppose somebody accepts that, and then they're going to read the discourses. Then what's the next thing they should be looking for?
Well, your question from a little bit earlier about how do you know what the context is this two noble disciples or one noble disciple, one ordinary person? How do you know? So what comes to mind for that is usually if it's addressed to monks and it just kind of leaves it at that, no other elaboration, that's generally a conversation between noble disciples, or the Buddha addressing bhikkhus. That's a good indication.
Yeah, in the discourses, conversation between monks are 9 out of 10 times between those who are already of right view. Nowadays the situation is different, but if somebody is studying the discourses, there's that. Okay, can we say anything more than this?
Sometimes I'll just flip to the end of a sutta before reading it, just kind of see how it plays out, because sometimes it is like, oh, magnificent, and and it says the Dhammai arose. That means that at the beginning of the conversation, they didn't have right view, but at the end, they acquired it.
Right.
So those are pretty valuable suttas, because that's like, okay, this is addressed to somebody without the right view, and the entire point of the conversation is, here's the right view.
Yes, so there are a number of discourses, you are saying, where somebody actually breaks through, so to speak, to the right understanding. And if we have agreed that newcomers are not yet of the right view, then those are the kinds of discourses they want to be looking into first and understand those first, because there's valuable clues there as to what leads to seeing the Dhamma directly for oneself. Right? Those discourses where somebody actually breaks through to the right understanding. That's one kind of discourse. There are a dozen or two such discourses in the Nikayas. Now, is there another type of discourse that is on that same level, so to speak? A kind of stock phrase that frequently appears in the suttas that people who are new should be looking out for.
Gradual training, or?
Well, yeah, although, yeah, that's actually true. There's gradual training, but there's also this stock phrase where it says here, an untaught ordinary person who has no regard for noble ones and has not known and seen the Dhamma regards things, and then there comes a description of how people who are not of the right view are regarding things, whether it be aggregates or sense bases or other aspects of their experience, which is then contrasted with how a well-instructed noble disciple who knows and sees the Dhamma regards things. And there are quite a number of those, and it's often a stock phrase. So that's another set of discourses which directly contrasts the understanding between those who are not of the right view and those who are. And so, are we saying that it would be good for somebody who wants to find access into the discourses to start looking for those as well?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that like that, but so, yeah, that's probably a good way to approach it. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, I think inevitably there's going to be, even in that approach, I think it's just very important to say that it's incredibly difficult to really, with all of the views that exist today, that are so prominent today, the scientific view, the religious views, it's the suttas are so broad in their phenomenological descriptions that it's incredibly difficult to see what they're saying in a sense. So yeah, I mean, you can say, start with these discourses or these.
Yes.
But
So now that we've given some indications that there are different kinds of discourses, that's what we said, right? Where someone gains the right view and these stock phrases you were just talking about. Suppose we leave that for now and we're going to discuss somebody's attitude towards those discourses.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned scientific view and religious view. Now, if somebody is a scholar or an academic and they are concerned with writing papers and they happen to take an interest in early Buddhism, and it's publish or perish, so there's pressure to put material out there. If that's their background attitude towards reading those discourses, then is that practically going to make any difference for them? Are they going to gain the right view if they're approaching the text with that intention?
Yeah, so they're coming to the text with that context, which is obviously not a wholesome one. The publish or perish attitude, for example, there's obviously craving involved in that, or financial incentives or whatever. But that's putting that aside. Even if those weren't there, to approach it in a scholarly way. It's not. The suttas are. They require authenticity, self-transparency. That's what the precepts are. That's why you have to take them on.
So can we make explicit what is then the difference between what we now call a scholarly attitude and an authentic attitude? Like, why is a scholarly attitude not going to be beneficial in terms of the goal of the real practice? What's the obstacle there? What's not seen in that attitude?
it's horizontal. It's the approach of taking in a lot of information and then using it to build up argumentations or discourse, bring up explanations in a sense of putting one notion after the other, whereas the authentic, if I'm right, as you call it, approach is to go in the experience itself and to find out, or through introspection to inquire how the human mind is working, if I can say. But what we were discussing before of the attitude, I would like to say, it's also important to see if someone comes to the Dhamma as newcomer or also afterwards with an attitude of openness in saying, I have my opinions like everyone has, but do I have a will to discuss, or not to take what I have as opinion for granted, and it's like this, and I know it, or am I available to hear the noble ones who have a knowledge which has to be acquired. And I think this is also a very helpful point to recognize if we are able to let go a little bit of our preconceived opinions.
So it is about coming to terms with one's own views and assumptions about oneself and the world.
Yes.
Now, when one adopts a scientific or academic or scholarly attitude, which is more or less the same, can your own views and assumptions come to light if you take an objective stance? If you are concerned with publicly observable phenomena?
Yeah, it's about suffering, isn't it? Is it about my existential suffering? You can't address that through the scientific or paradigm or scholarly attitude.
No. So the whole nature of human existence, of personal existence, is fully outside the scope of the scientific domain. So we're not saying that there's anything wrong with science, it's just that the Dhamma is outside of the phenomena that science investigates. And so one's own views and assumptions are not publicly observable, for example. And yet, the whole practice begins, in a sense, by coming to terms with one's own views and assumptions about the world, putting them next to how the noble ones regard things, and then the question becomes, am I regarding things the way ordinary people do, or am I regarding things the way the noble ones do? And if you find a discrepancy there, then the question is, why do you hold on to the way ordinary people regard things? Because if that would be right, you wouldn't suffer. But if you wouldn't suffer, then what's the point of even reading the discourses? So there is a question of coming to terms with one's own view and, let's say, substituting those views for the right views that we are saying are reflected in the discourses. And there's nothing scientific about that.
Yeah, and that's what is defining whether the attitude is authentic or not, is whether it pertains to suffering. And that's,
And that's a subjective reference point.
Yeah.
Which the Buddha kept all the way. If the Buddha would have been a scientist, he would never have become the Buddha. That's a contradiction. He kept asking himself, am I still liable to suffering? If this happens, if that happens, then would that still affect my mind? And when the answer is yes, there are still things that can disturb my mind, he would not declare full complete awakening. That's a completely subjective reference point. And so that has to be established from the outset, because otherwise one's whole frame of reference, as you put it, is just going to be, or as you put it actually, it's going to be misinterpreted. And then it's like, well, I interpret it like this and I interpret it like that. But in the end, the Dhamma is seen individually by those who are wise. So then there's no question of different interpretations. It either resolves the existential burden, which is the dukkha, or doesn't. So then, in addition to certain kinds of discourses that are worthwhile perhaps looking into first, but is of equal importance, or perhaps even more important actually, is to approach the discourses with the right attitude. And we have said so far that the attitude is to not assume that one has understood what has not been understood, and secondly, to come to terms with one's own views and opinions and put them next to what one reads in the discourses, and then be honest with oneself. Am I regarding things the way the noble ones do, or not?
Am I suffering? Am I liable to suffering?
Am I still liable to suffering? And if that is the attitude, and somebody is transparent and honest, then does it in the end really matter what kind of suttas they read?
No, I mean, most of the bhikkhus, I mean, they didn't, none of the bhikkhus had access to the Nikayas during the time of the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they would have, many of them would have had, only a few interactions with the Buddha or with his disciples. So,
so that's the other thing. Actually, the goal is not to read all the discourses or translate all of them or learn them all by heart, because in fact, most people, even Arahats, did not necessarily hear all the Buddha's teaching. So, it's better to fully understand and see all the implications of a few discourses than to have knowledge of all of them, but not see anything directly for yourself. Now, how many discourses nowadays people need to reflect upon in order for the right view to land will of course differ from individual to individual. And in a sense, it's a very rich situation that all the discourses are there, but we should not conflate, or a newcomer should not conflate the idea that it is about accumulating knowledge, because that's just more desire. It's about actually understanding the original question and the answers that are recorded in those discourses. Now, if we have said all of this to a newcomer, right, to somebody who comes here and says where to begin with the discourses, then have we come up with a sufficient answer, or is there anything more that we should say?
Maybe hear the discourses or read the discourses is one thing, but also hearing the Dhamma from someone in which one can have confidence is also very, very helpful. Or maybe watching some living people speaking about it can also help in addition of in more, or how can I say, complementary to reading the texts and just coming to terms with them by oneself.
Yeah, because texts don't speak back to you, and they don't say whether you've interpreted them rightly or not. And so there's perhaps a third category of discourses that we can briefly mention, right? In addition to the ones where somebody breaks to the Dhamma and that stock phrase that contrasts ordinary people with the noble ones, there are also a collection of discourses where the factors for the arising of the right view are being discussed. And if gaining the right view is the most important thing that a newcomer should look out for, then to be aware what the factors for the arising of the right view are is obviously of key importance, right? And one of the factors for right view is hearing true Dhamma, which obviously means that if somebody is talking about it, they are ipso facto a noble disciple. And one needs to attend to those teachings rightly, which is the Yoniso Manasikara, but that deserves a whole separate discussion, so I suggest we don't go into that just now. But those are the two factors for the arising of right view, and this is sometimes further elaborated upon by saying that, you know, to hang out with those people who are already of right view is greatly beneficial. So there's that as well. But, you know, if somebody has no knowledge of the discourses, how are they ever going to recognize whether somebody else is presenting the Buddha's teaching rightly? You see, that's going to be a difficulty. So even if one wants to follow someone else out of faith, I would still say that it is better to also make an effort to become familiar with the Pali Nikayas, just to make sure that you're placing your faith rightly. Because if you're following someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, then you can basically spend the rest of your life practicing things that do not bring right results. And you cannot start blaming the other person because you are the one who decided to put your faith there. Right? Or not? What do you say?
Yeah, it's sometimes it seems to me it's really also it's also a kind of it's a kind of how can I say? It's not easy. How can one be sure? Okay, following this this interpretation, I will go the way which I will afterwards, after having explored and investigated, find the right or not. What you say about reading, learning the Pali, or is this what you?
No, I didn't say learning the Pali. I said reading the Pali suttas.
Reading the Pali,
which can be in a translation with.
Okay,
right?
yeah, reading the suttas.
Yes,
okay.
reading the suttas.
Yes,
and so what then to look for in someone else? Do the discourses say anything about that? Are there qualities that give at least some indication that someone might know what they're talking about? Perhaps we can conclude our discussion by clearing that up. If there are some indications, like, I mean, one doesn't really know whether somebody else has it until you yourself have it. And even then, there are discourses where arahats don't recognize other arahats. But okay, being an arahat, that's not really an issue. But, you know, so how are you going to recognize whether somebody else knows what they're talking about? Can we come up with some indications, some things that at least point in the right direction?
Well, it always has to be rooted in this authenticity that we talked about, and responsibility in terms of really, am I liable to suffering, and is this helping me to come out of my liability to suffering? Is this teaching helping me?
Mm-hmm.
Without that authenticity, then that is, it's impossible. I mean, it's so easy to follow somebody because they're charismatic or they look confident, or because there's so many other people following them, or all sorts of reasons. But this criteria of am I suffering, or am I liable to suffering, is what the Buddha was pointing to, or what his entire teaching is contained within.
So following someone's instruction and then checking for oneself whether one's suffering diminishes. That is how you can see if you're moving in the right direction. But you see, we are still talking one step back, like where to put your faith. So if somebody doesn't even observe, let's say, 5 or 8 precepts, is it worthwhile listening to someone like that?
No.
Yeah, good point. What is always said to start with the sila, with the restraint, but there also it needs an understanding to make a reason why is this let's say a prerequisite.
Sure, that understanding can follow, but that's of course never going to happen if you're listening to someone who himself or herself doesn't even follow these basic precepts, right? Is seclusion a factor? If somebody's always surrounded by other people,
Yes.
is that a good indication or not?
Yeah, that's also criteria.
And then, as the suttas say, you have to get to know someone, not like on a personal, intimate level, that's not always meant, but it takes, for this authentic attitude that you were referring to, that's not so easy to discern if you just meet someone for the first time. So it takes some time with someone, or to regularly see someone, in order to find out if you can catch a glimpse of that attitude. It's not just once or twice or in public occasions. And as we see so often, then behind the scene, all the scandals and the misdemeanors come to the surface, but publicly it can all look great. So one wants to be careful with that. So we're talking about precepts, sense restraint, seclusion, and look for an attitude of authenticity, honesty, and people themselves being serious about that. And perhaps everything else is up to the individual and to resolve their own doubts, which are going to be there anyway, until they're not.
Well, that could be misleading.
What do you
in
mean?
the sense of
No, I mean subjectively, right? Does a noble disciple have doubt about what is Dhamma?
no.
Right. So since the whole goal is to see Dhamma, then there will always be doubt about what Dhamma is and what Dhamma is not, and whether somebody else is perhaps speaking in accordance with Dhamma or not,
Yes.
until one sees for oneself, right?
Yeah.
Or did you mean something else?
It just maybe could have been interpreted that the sort of the doubt is something that one could in a way encourage or but that's not what you meant, obviously.
No.
You just qualified it by saying but the attitude that towards doubt is to see it as doubt and not to get absorbed in the content of the doubt, obviously.
Yes.
And, but that's
to recognize doubt as a phenomena will be necessary in order to abandon doubt. But that will be, in the end, up to the individual practitioner. That's not going to be external circumstances resolving that. And that will already be part of looking at one's own mind and taking one's whole attitude subjectively. I would be careful with the word introspection, by the way, which you used earlier. I don't think I would use it like that, but to keep the subjective perspective and to realize that doubt is also part of suffering, and that it is an aspect of seeing things rightly, that there can't be any doubt about it, right?
One other thing that I find interesting to look for in prospective teacher is their emphasis on personal responsibility. So is this teacher somebody who is trying to teach you how to be independent of them? A good teacher doesn't want their students to call them up every time they have a question. A good teacher wants to teach the material so that those students can become independent in their understanding of it. So
a noble disciple is independent of others in his understanding. So if a teacher is setting himself up in a way that students only become more dependent on his teaching or his organization or his methods or technique, that should already be a big red flag. Yeah, it's another factor. Quite right.
There are no secret stages.
There are no secrets?
No secret stages in the teaching.
There's no secrecy. That's now the other thing. People who want to belong to something special, to something exclusive, that they might be drawn in by taking special vows and do preliminary practices and become part of something secret or esoteric. Is there any such aspect in the early Buddhist teaching? No. So the Buddha himself explicitly said that there's nothing held back in the closed fist of the teacher. So the Dhamma, from that point of view, is accessible and apparent here and now, which doesn't mean publicly observable, but it is apparent here and now and accessible. So anyone who says, join my secret club, should be another big red flag. Quite right. Any other factors?
Well, I think going back to the suttas, they have a consistent framework or context or understanding of all the suttas. That every single sutta it's not like one sutta saying one thing, the other sutta saying another thing. Yeah, there is this consistent understanding which enables every sutta to be easily understood in the sense that it's effortless because they abide in this understanding that incorporates all the suttas, or incorporates
right. So
all
Dhamma,
phenomena.
yes. So Dhamma is not patchwork. It's not like, we've got some people who have understood this collection of discourses, but there's a separate sect that has understood those kind of discourses. We're saying that Dhamma is one vision.
Yeah.
And so somebody should be capable of at least pointing out, if you can put it like that, that which all the discourses have in common, so to speak.
Yeah, so they might never have heard certain words, but then if it's explained to them, they're like, oh yeah, that's what you mean. Oh yeah. So it's not like they have this sort of etymological, knowledge of or information. They just have this understanding which enables them to which incorporates all phenomena.
All phenomena.
Possible. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's about the meaning and not just about the phrasing. Even though phrasing plays its part, we're not going to have quarrels back and forth about phrasing as such.
Yes.
It's important that somebody can explain in their own terms the meaning
of suffering.
Exactly.
How to get out of suffering.
Yeah, so that's what all discourses have in common. Suffering and the ending of suffering. If somebody has that reference point, then it doesn't really matter which suttas they begin with in the end. If their attitude is right, then every discourse should point in the same direction. It might do so to different degrees, or it might stop a bit earlier and doesn't go all the way, but they should all go in the same direction. And that's what one wants to become familiar with that direction where suffering ceases, and then to just work on it. Yes.